this event. Jenny is ACWW's Project Grants Officer based in Central Office in London. She is an international development professional with expertise in gender and grant making and has strong interests in sustainable agriculture and climate change. She holds a master's degree in gender and development from the Institute of Development Studies and has worked in rural and urban communities across East and West Africa. She administrates all project-related aspects of ACWW and supports the funded projects throughout the project cycle. Jenny played a crucial role in the development of the new project strategy adopted by ACWW's board in 2022 and is attending CSW for the first time this year. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, Monty, for that very warm introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in the team, in the room and online. And a very warm welcome to our youth event today, Rural Youth for Action, within CSW62. To give a little recap on the agreed conclusions that we are talking about today, in 2018, the Commission met on a priority theme, challenges and opportunities in achieving gender equality and empowerment of rural women and girls, calling for continuing education for pregnant adolescents, young and single mothers, comprehensive formal, non-formal and informal education on sexual and reproductive health, human rights and power dynamics, and addressing the digital divide that disproportionately affects rural women and girls. This was truly impactful work. To acknowledge in this way the significance of the unequal opportunities that women and girls in rural areas have before them. Women, girls and young people across the world in otherwise contrasting situations and contexts face barriers to education, opportunities and services that they need in ways that are far too similar. From our work at ACWW with our amazing project partners, we know that the impact on women and young girls in rural areas has been devastating by COVID-19 and lockdown measures. Many of our projects were on hold or unable to reach the participants that they had set out to help due to issues around access and schools shutting down. One project in Tamil Nadu in southern India was halfway through their planned activities, going to schools to teach about mental health and well-being education before they had to completely refocus the aims of their program. Once the schools had shut down, they could no longer reach the young women and men students to whom they had been providing such important life skills. I think it's really important here to make the connection between thinking about the impact of the pandemic on rural women, girls and young people in general, and the priority theme for this year's CSW, innovation and technological change and education in the digital age. During times of significant change and isolation for rural communities, such as during the pandemic, digital connectivity became more important than ever, and the lack of it within so many communities became more obvious than ever. At the core of any possible lasting change is equitable access to quality formal and informal education for all rural women and girls, and this will form the basis of our discussion today. Before I ask our speakers to introduce themselves, I would just like to invite you all to write down a question or two on your phone or in your notebooks as the discussion goes on, and I'll be coming back to you for these during our Q&A session. I'm sure there'll be lots of ideas and sparks generated by our wonderful speakers today. To those joining us online, please do make use of the chat and Q&A features on Zoom, and we will pick up your questions after the discussion. Unfortunately, due to ill health, we are no longer able to have Tharindra Amaparama from Sri Lanka, a youth member of Global Youth Mobilization, with us today, and I know that she wishes she could have been here too. But I am delighted to welcome Kirsty Stage,
who has joined us. Kirsty, I think I will start with you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you to ACWW for hosting this event today. I'm delighted to be here and I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say. So I thought I'd begin with a little introduction of myself. My name is Kirsty Sage, my pronouns are she, her. As it has become common practice for me, I would like to give a visual description of myself. I have long brown hair, I'm wearing rectangular glasses, I'm a white woman and wearing a navy blazer and a striped dress, multicolored dress. I'm here at the Commission on the Status of Women representing the National Council of Women Great Britain. And I'm also a director of the Disability Policy Centre. Outside of the policy and advocacy work that I do, I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I create a collaborative project with the British Library looking at disabled people and work from 1970 to 2010. So a lot of my work looks at gender and youth and disability. So I'm hoping to use that as a frame to share some thoughts on the 2018 report. I guess one reason why I'm interested in this work is my own lived experience as a deaf woman. I also, growing up from about 11 to 16, was in a rural countryside in Wiltshire, and we had no internet access. So it meant that a lot of my schoolwork and my homework had to be done in the library, in the public library. So I really felt this theme of rural women and rural young people really spoke to me and some of my earlier experiences. And I think connectivity, bringing together different communities, but also understanding how communities vary is something that I'm really interested in. And I hope that we can tease out some of the parallels in the conversation today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Ann Kelly. I am here with ACWW, and previously I also worked in the United Nations Office for the Society of the Sacred Heart, which is a Catholic order dedicated to the education of girls that's active in 42 countries around the world. So a lot of my work has been focused on bringing girls to the United Nations, creating space for them to use their own voices to advocate for issues that they care about. I also have a PhD in educational psychology and methodology from the State University of New York. My specialty is looking at girls' education and the systemic inequities that girls face in accessing national educational systems around the world. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so happy to hear about what Kirsty and Liz do in their spaces, and also with what Jenny does in her with ACWW. Myself, my name is Judith Juma. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and it is very interesting to be in this space and to highlight some of the work that I do working with rural women, rural girls, and I must say rural youth. In light of the subject that we are having. I would like to introduce myself. First, most people are surprised when I say that I'm a firstborn in my family. I have two sisters who are younger than me, and when you look at us when we're placed in a room, most people think that I'm the lastborn, probably because of my body, and therefore I also get mistaken about my age. And that is okay. I also still fall within the youth brackets. A little bit professionally, I am an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. And while most people think the conventional way would be to practice law in courts and make some money and pray so much that you get some consultation fees, I decided that it would be more beneficial, not just for me, but also for the women around the world, to work with them and to highlight the issues that they face. And because I have that opportunity to work in courts of law, I represent victims of sexual and gender-based violence when the opportunity comes without asking them to pay any fees. And with time, last year, 2022, I came up with an idea with the other sets of lawyers where we decided to register a community-based organization so that we could leverage on the opportunity to get some young girls and even women to be represented, not just by us, but also with a network of lawyers who are willing to take up those cases. And so last year, early this year, we introduced a youth representative in our organization who is 19 years old, who has been our focal point with primary and secondary schools in Kenya. And this youth representative helps us report on some cases that young people are facing in terms of access to education, in terms of digital illiteracy, in terms of a variety of issues that we think should be brought to the attention of the government. And so the Social Justice League also joined a network of pro bono lawyers this year. And that network is called the Pro Bono Institute of Kenya, which is a first of its kind because we do not have such before it, we never had such an organization in Kenya. And when we started out as an organization, our first activity was having a HIV awareness program in a primary school that is in Homa Bay County. And that was seen by another school that is in Nairobi, and they approached me and asked whether I could sit in their board as a youth representative and legal advisor, and I graciously accepted. In addition to that, the partnerships that SJL, Social Justice League, has with primary and high schools in Kenya has allowed us to interact with young people in our work in various programmatic areas, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I will be very happy to share some of our experiences and to also learn from my counterparts here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. I'm excited to be sat at a table with some really inspiring women. Kirsty, I would like to invite you to start the discussion, please.
Thank you so much, and great to meet everybody else. So I thought I'd begin by having a look at the 2018 report, which looks at rural women and girls. And unsurprisingly, but unfortunately, there were only 9 mentions of disability throughout the whole document. So these references were part of 4 paragraphs. 9 times is absolutely is unacceptable, really. But what I'll do in this presentation is go through each of the sections and think about some of the areas, some of the recommendations, some improvements, and some of the work that we've been doing at the Disability Policy Centre to think about improving and working on these certain agreements. Before I start, I would like to say that I'm sharing some comments about how young people and young women in particular with disabilities have lost access to education during the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is still ongoing for many people. Many people are still isolating or shielding, and this is something that I wanted to mention. When I'm talking about deaf people, I'm talking about a cultural and linguistic group of people in Britain, and sometimes these people do not identify with the disabled category, and I just wanted to make that clear. So back onto the 2018 report and the 9 mentions of disability. So the first time it's mentioned is in paragraph 37, and the focus is on stigmatization and an increased risk of violence, exploitation and abuse, including sexual violence and abuse. There's also a mention in this paragraph around limited access to justice and equal recognition before the law, as well as political and public life and opportunities to engage in that. So there's a strong focus on independence and inclusion in communities and the ability to exercise freedom to make their own choices. These are all really good discussions to be part of. There are so many different conversations going on at the moment, and during CSW, I've had a lot of different conversations with people about barriers to reporting incidences, for instance. So a large proportion of cases, unfortunately, come from people like carers or family members or people within the support network. So it makes reporting really difficult. Not only there might be language or accessibility barriers, but there might be personal reasons for people being unable to report such incidences before criminal processes. There's also a discussion here around awareness of rights. Are people aware of what rights they have? Is it often provided in simple English, for instance? What about people who are trying to interpret this legislation in a second language? So these conversations around autonomy, independence, choice and agency are really central to making people feel empowered and able to make informed decisions in their own day-to-day life. Thinking more explicitly about political and public life, we see a lack of representation of disabled people, disabled young people, disabled women, and this is a really big problem. There are different barriers that have been identified, from financial implications to attitudinal barriers. In the UK, less than 2% of our parliament self-identify as disabled. It's slightly better at local government level. There's just over 60% of councillors self-identifying as disabled. But within political parties, within specific policy spaces and women's organisations, as well as civil society, this is something that I urge everybody in this room, virtually and physically, to think about. What can we do to not only bring women to the table, disabled women to the table, but to also have a part in utilising their skills, enjoying this company and enjoying taking up positions of power. And sometimes that access is there, but there are still barriers to people contributing and being able to feel part of discussions and political decisions. So moving on to the second paragraph, where disability is mentioned in KK, there's a focus on scaling up financing and investments in public education systems. So there's a lot of focus on curriculums, textbooks, methodologies, accessible schooling, transportation, facilities, training, scholarships, fellowships. And this idea around education and employment and unemployment are really important and should be discussed, and issues that all affect young, rural, disabled women. There's been a lot of conversation around entrepreneurship during CSW and small medium enterprises being the backbone of our economic structure. One of the projects that I've been involved with the Disability Policy Centre has been around backing disabled entrepreneurs. So we found out that disabled-owned businesses contribute to almost 10% of the UK's GDP, and 25% of small businesses are disabled-owned. So what we're doing at the Disability Policy Centre is working with FTSE 500, Clue, different organisations through an initiative called Access to Funding. We're collecting data, working with the global investment community, and tackling stigma through storytelling. So entrepreneurship and employment and investment structures are pivotal to the empowerment of disabled women, disabled young women, and help to develop those skill sets, both in education practices, but later on in employment structures. We've also done quite a lot of work in the field of education. Last year, at the end of last year, we released a report looking at how to share best practice and create hubs across different educational structures. So mainstream education in the UK and specialist schools. We've also called on better data sharing, but also thinking about working across different education practices and developing connections with higher education and further education. But noting that education is something that is holistic, that is fluid, and there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, visibility in education and role models is so important for our young disabled rural women. And it would be great to think about systems for there to be people reflected in curriculums, so in Disability History Month and throughout the year, but also people who are doing that training. On the third section, a third paragraph where disability is mentioned in the 2018 report has been looking at the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And it goes into quite a lot of depth about how this might occur. I think this is really important because ableism often interacts with so many other forms of oppression, from racism to homophobia to transphobia. And it's really important that we understand how discrimination operates and manifests. And also when we're developing policy options, that they don't happen in silos. We're not just talking about gender, we're not just talking about women. People have multiple identities, layers to their identity, and policy really needs to take that into account. And finally, in the document, there's a strong focus on national statistics and a push for disaggregated data by sex, by age, by disability and other characteristics. And this is really important for identifying so many different things, the number of disabled women we have in our populations, but also to work out creative solutions to tackling some of the barriers that they face. And I think our role as civil society is to contribute to these statistic gathering initiatives, but to also think about what can we do with disaggregated data, which will meaningfully impact the inclusion of different communities. So I wanted to put forward very quickly some final thoughts and suggestions and link to the other themes of CSW this year. So I've touched upon, firstly, disaggregated data, looking at an intersectional analysis, finding missing gaps in identifying, acknowledging, and addressing the scope of the problem that we face, and trying to come up with creative solutions. There are multiple forms of oppression and discrimination facing young disabled women and girls, as well as gender diverse groups. Secondly, making sure that disabled women and girls are put forward in conversations, that there's not a question of making sure that they're just at the table, but thinking about the conditions at which the table they sit at. So for things like accessibility, these conditions are not half-baked ideas, but they're thought through first, that there's an idea of investment. But also thinking about how we as civil society work with disabled people's organisations and disabled-led groups from a real grassroots perspective. So disability is a topic that isn't happening on its own, but is integrated within conversations because it is something that affects everyone. And finally, taking disabled women and girls seriously. Education, empowerment, learning about rights are all things that we should be considering with this theme. And technology has so many different roles, but one role I think that is particularly important is thinking about how this can drive forward these ideas of rights and empowerment and act as a facilitator. And in some final words, I just wanted to link it to the broader themes. So technology has been absolutely fundamental as a means of developing community. For instance, on Twitter, you've got #DisabilityTwitter, which brings together a lot of different disabled voices, including young disabled women. But there are online dangers and harms that must be addressed. And there are still barriers that persist. For instance, the cost of assistive tech or the lack of connectivity. And that's something that we've seen across the pandemic. So I'll finish there for now, but I think the focus on disaggregated data, the attitudinal and the cultural barriers all play a part in this conversation. And I want to thank ACWW for including disability in this discussion because it's often forgotten about.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. For 9 mentions of disability, there are 195 mentions of rural women in that document. So just 9 mentions of disability is just, yeah, that's really lacking. And I think talking about disaggregated data is something that has been mentioned a lot this week. It keeps coming up in conversations that I've been in. So I think that's, yes, such an important point. With gathering this data, we need to do something with it. Absolutely. Liz, over to you.
Yeah, I'm actually going to start by talking about data collection techniques. And some of the issues therein. So in education specifically, there are 2 very large international studies, the Trends in Mathematics and Science study, which is run by the OECD, and then also the Program for International Student Achievement, which is run by IEA. So both of these studies are large-scale international data sets. So they're pulling from, I think, about 90 countries in total, if you go between both of them. And they have very large influences on national policies, as well as United Nations policy regarding education. But their data collection procedures allow for very specific cohorts to be removed or not even collected. Specifically, they do not require nations to collect data from special education environments. So many disabled students are not included in these conversations. And also inaccessible schools. And by inaccessible schools, they mean rural schools. So a lot of rural girls are not included. And I'm going to actually pull out a couple of examples. So in Georgia, only native Georgian speakers are included in the Georgian data set. If you're familiar with the historical political situation in Georgia, there's a lot of ethnic tensions. And so the United Nations has gotten a little bit involved in the Georgian education system, and Georgia has agreed that non-Georgian speakers will be included fairly into the education system. But there's no way for us to double check that this is actually happening. We have no knowledge about these students' achievement because they're not included in these international data sets. This data is not collected. In Canada, only Ontario and Quebec were included in the latest Trends in Mathematics and Science study collection round. And the PISA excludes Indigenous students living on reservations. So in total, it's only representative of about 69% of the Canadian population. And specifically, it's the richest and whitest provinces that have data collected on them. In China, China uses a Hoku system in their public education system. So basically, what a person has access to in terms of government services depends on their Hoku, whether it's an urban or a rural Hoku. You can live anywhere you want, but in order to access those services, you need to go back to your Hoku province. So rural Hoku holders living in an urban area, you can now get primary education, but if you would like to continue and get secondary education, you have to go back to your rural Hoku, which is based on your parents' place of origin, not where you were actually born. So you may need to go back to a province where you have no family connection or support. As a result, while 100% of urban Hoku holders finish high school, only 70% of rural Hoku holders are able to finish their secondary education. And only 2% of rural students access university compared to 54% of urban students. If policy, national education policy is going to be based on this data, and we have a lot of research showing that it is, then we need to be more aware of the hidden figures that are behind this data and that are not being included. And I think this is especially important as we're recovering from COVID-19. I spent 2020 as a university lecturer here in New York, but upstate. For anyone who isn't aware, the state of New York is largely rural and quite poor. And if you take Manhattan out of the equation, the state of New York is the poorest state in the United States. Going into lockdown, teaching largely inner city or rural poor students, that was my university's population, there was a major barrier as our students had to go home in terms of their access to technology. 30% of my students at the beginning of lockdown had to return to their Indigenous reservations where they did not necessarily have access to broadband internet. My university required me to provide my classes via Zoom, which is great if you have high-speed broadband internet, but if you don't, it doesn't really work out particularly well. Despite subsidy programs for rural poor in New York, several First Nations don't have access, and that they have access to high-speed internet, but not low-cost high-speed internet, and that includes the Oneida, the Tuscarora, and the Tonawanda Seneca. 40% of New Yorkers do not have, only 40% of New Yorkers have access to low-cost internet, which means less than $60 a month. And the highest percentage of people by race who do not have access to high-speed internet are Indigenous students. I can tell you that of the 30% of my students who were at the university, only half of them were able to complete their degrees because of their access to the internet. They were all scholarship students. They didn't have access to the internet, so they weren't able to keep their grades up, so they lost their scholarships and were forced to remain on their reservations, continuing the cycle of poverty. For another example of challenges that some of my students were facing, about 3 weeks into lockdown, one of my students came to my office hours and told me that she was pregnant. She was concerned about being able to continue her undergraduate degree if she had a baby, so therefore she wanted to have an abortion, but she did not know how to access an abortion while in lockdown, and she didn't feel safe telling her parents. So luckily, I was teaching human development and psychology. She knew that I would know how to help her because it was part of the class content, so I was able to put her into contact with people who could help her. But this is a major barrier, especially coming out of COVID-19. There was a huge increase in gender-based violence as well as unwanted pregnancies that we then had to address. And we need to keep moving forward. And we also, all of the women who are forced to give birth against their will as a result of COVID-19, we need to make sure that there are services available to them so that they are able to continue their education. National policy is the biggest predictor of girls' academic achievement. My research shows that if you create a model of girls' education achievement, and you look at the individual level, the classroom level, and the national level, there's about equal amounts of, each level is about equally responsible for the girls' achievement. If you then look at the variables and how variables predict that achievement, the variables included in the Trends in Mathematics and Science study and the PISA, the Program for International Student Achievement, they explain about 17% of the girls' achievement at their individual level and about 14% of their achievement at the classroom level. So those variables are not particularly explanatory of their achievement. But that 30% at the national level, 74% of it is explained by the variables that are contained in national policy and societal practices. So we have a really good understanding of what goes into girls' achievement when we're talking about national legislation, national policy, and culture. And that's so because we have this understanding, we really need to be focusing on adjusting that so that we have more equity across national policies. And we need to take into account all of the different contexts in which girls are being educated. This is something we were talking about earlier. We need to take into account the context in which girls are being educated and shape policy to work within these contexts. This is especially important for girls because research shows that girls have more in common with each other across borders in some ways than they do with the boys in the classroom sitting next to them when we're trying to predict their educational achievement.
Thank you so much. I think I have related with quite a lot about, especially on education, what quality education means from one girl to the next, or from one country to the next. And I think I would also start with an example because in Kenya, what happened, especially when COVID hit, is that the government rolled out a program where students would, it started with staying at home, waiting for the government to come up with a policy on how do we proceed with education. So it took around 4 to 5 months, no learning, to figure out how do we do this. So it was basically out of we are also the government, we don't know what to do. So now 4 months later, the government comes up with, okay, there is Zoom working all over the world. Let us leverage on that. So there was Zoom, there was Microsoft Teams, there was Google Meet. It was used by most largely universities. And what happened is that students were given airtime, they were given phones, and they were given mobile data that expires at the end of the month, and you wait for your next batch of airtime and mobile data like that. But at the same time, when you dig deeper, you realize this only happened in schools that are in the urban areas. Mm-hmm. You go to the rural areas and you realize this program was not properly rolled out, or those who are in the most remote areas are not having this benefit. So these phones, this mobile data, and this airtime was not for every student. So the effect of that is that a whole year, 2020, going into 2021, there are those who are out of school. So you get back to 2021 and you're told, oh, you're going to repeat class, when the world was now recovering and trying to get back to school. Many students in the rural areas had to repeat class that they would have taken, you know. So that was a whole 1.5 years of wasted time. And another thing was that students would report, those who are now accessing this digital technology would report problems in accessing Zoom. Even the simplest, those functionalities that we think are simple, some students will report they did not know how to use them. They did not know how to navigate. And so to them, it was quite a sophisticated system that they could not really work out. And then there's the question of the attention span. You're in a class, you have to sit for 3 to 4 hours of a lecture. And so it becomes difficult to retain the knowledge that you're getting online. And because it was also something new to some students, they were trying to adjust to it because you are used to socializing with your fellow students in class, and now you're at home, you're alone. So bouncing ideas on the subject at hand, you don't have that opportunity. And now there was the question of how do we now integrate learning videos that would ensure that even if students lose the attention span, they can still recover. Mind you, I'm speaking of what benefit the children in urban areas had. They would have integrated videos in the lectures so that it could benefit them. But for rural students, remember they are out of school, they're not benefiting from digital technology, so they're basically left out. Again, there was a question of location. For rural areas where digital technology reached, some students could not walk all the way to access probably a cyber cafe and listen to a lecture. And if you access the cyber cafe, of course, it's not for free. There are cost implications to it. So that was also a factor. Even if it reached rural areas, there are those who could not get to the designated locations for accessibility of the classes. And now I'd like to also talk about the subject of health, because it integrates with education, in the sense that I work with rural women and girls who talk about the fact that they never get comprehensive sexuality education. And as you're saying, I think I talked to you about why is it that this student approached you and did not approach the parent. It is because of our social construct. From home to home, it varies how open young adults want to speak about certain issues to their parents. And also there's an age factor. They look at you probably as a young person and they say, I'm more comfortable talking to my teacher about this. So there's the education system that we have, which looks mostly at the conventional careers. So we have at the time I was joining university, it was quite prestigious to study law. So I had to, there was a lot of pressure. It's either you do law, you study engineering, or you study medicine, and the rest were others. They were grouped as others, But the point is, even with those others, comprehensive sexuality education is not usually included in our curriculum. Young people do not know, when I get my menstruation, this is how I go about it. This is who I talk to. This is how I can get help. This is how I protect myself. This is how I put myself in a hygienic way. And so young people, especially those living in the rural areas, miss out on that. And those living in the urban areas, there could be, you were talking about access. There could be access to sexual health services. But again, they are fearful to go and say, oh, I have had this problem. How can I go about it? So we have policies that fail to penetrate the nitty-gritties of sexual health for young people, whether rural or urban. So I made some proposals of what I think out of the review theme of CSW67 on what was said at CSW62. I made some proposals of what are the characteristics of our youth-friendly health services. And I think about accessibility to them in terms of the location and in terms of the health professional that they want to talk to. And then these health services should also be acceptable. It should meet the expectations of that young person. Number three, they ought to be appropriate in the sense that the required care is provided and no unnecessary or harmful health practices are forced on that person just because they do not have the knowledge of the kind of tests that they are being subjected to. Fourthly, healthcare should be comprehensive in the sense that if I'm suffering on a particular disease, it should cover all aspects of that particular disease. And a youth should be informed well in advance before being subjected to certain services of the kind of tests that they're going to go through from step one to last. Again, these services should provide a positive change to the adolescent. That means our health systems should have progressive checking, not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas where the youth is informed. You should come after this particular time so that we check how you're progressing, how you're faring on, if you're improving or if things are not well. And then it boils down also to the facility itself. There are questions about the location, the question about confidentiality between the youth and the health provider. And of course, issues to do with immunization from common illnesses. Again, speaking of COVID, it is sad that COVID-19 actually did not penetrate in all areas, despite the fact that there was a rollout of several from booster to booster, but there were those who did not even get the first one that was rolled out in countries. And lastly, now speaking of special services when it comes to health, I'm thinking about victims of rape and sexual assault. The way they ought to be catered for is very different from those who have come to a hospital on other areas, on other health illnesses. And it is not just about going to a hospital. Youth should also have the opportunity for the services to come to them. If they're in rural areas, it means that I don't have to walk over 1,000 miles to access the next service provider. There should be, at the very least, services being brought to their benefits. Yeah, and I think that's it. I read about some very interesting facts from Human Rights Watch, because they were monitoring how health was rolled out and education was rolled out during COVID-19, especially in African states. And this is a 2022 report where Human Rights Watch said out of 54 African states, it is only 38 that have laws that had policies that ensured continued education for adolescent girls during pregnancy and motherhood during COVID-19. And the remaining states, at the time COVID-19 hit, never had responsive mechanisms in the form of policies. And it is worrying because it ought to have been a full transition in all the 54 states. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I feel like the ideas of non-formal education are so prevalent to this. When schools and universities shut down, aside from your traditional formal education, where do you get that information from that is accurate, that is reliable, that is trustworthy? Yes, you can use the internet or your friends, but where are they getting that information from? Yeah, absolutely.
And especially for health information,
Yeah.
that's incredibly important.
Exactly.
Getting a good source.
Yeah. So I would now like to open it up to a bit of a discussion between us. And maybe I will, if I can find my notes. Or if anyone else would like to kick off the discussion, please go ahead while I trawl through my phone.
You mentioned some of the changes around practice of attitudes of topics that might come up during the pandemic. And it made me think about somebody's experience that they were telling me about this morning as a deaf woman who became blind over the pandemic. And not only was there delays in terms of diagnosis or monitoring somebody's condition, but one of the accessibility tools they were learning about was tactile sign language. And during the pandemic, when there's a focus on not touching people, not spreading, actually, I thought this is a really interesting example. And similarly, I've got friends who are visually impaired or blind, and guiding was another thing that was really, really hard to do, particularly by members of the public who, or friends who were saying, oh, let me take you out, but actually I'm a bit worried about this. So it made me think about, okay, yeah, this is another issue that we can see like a parallel in. And another thing was a bit like what you were saying earlier around healthcare. And I'd mentioned a lot about the different forms of crossover with identity characteristics. And I think disability, gender and sexuality are really interesting. There's often the assumption that disabled people do not have sex and therefore do not need access to specific services within healthcare. And you can see that with some of the provisions or lack of provisions, for instance, in women's health services. So smear tests, for instance, are they accessible for wheelchair users? is the physical environment built for disabled people of different experiences to be able to engage with that. And similarly, the final thing I want to end on was around health and access to people who don't have English as a first language, particularly people who use British Sign Language. There's a really interesting space of trying to develop policy and understanding within healthcare settings to make sure that people know a little bit of basic BSL, that there are interpreters available, so people know what is going on, but can be part of that consultation process. And I think Zoom and other platforms are really interesting in that. If there's a lack of connectivity, there's bad internet connection, you're almost dependent on what somebody's saying, and you can't, it's not a two-way dialogue. So those are my kind of thoughts on some of the things that you mentioned.
And sorry, I'd like to react to what you've said, because even when we talk about disability, there are different kinds of disability, including mental, intellectual disability. And when we have, even in the absence of COVID-19, our policies in most times do not cater for the different levels of disability that human beings face. And it became difficult to address that when COVID-19 hit. And now we like to say we are past COVID-19, but not really. We are still trying to be careful. But what if another instance of another pandemic happens, maybe of higher worrying levels? And you find that people living with disability, I like to say people living with disability instead of disabled people, to be sensitive. When we have another different level of pandemic, how would the world react to addressing some of the issues they face when at the time of COVID, it wasn't comprehensive, it wasn't all-inclusive. So these policies, even in our spaces, we need to be innovative about going forward. What can technology do to ensure that we handle world shocks, so to say, so that no one is left behind? And if I'm in this particular category, there's actually a breakdown of there's a subcategory inside categories. Yeah, even persons with disability, their needs are not clear cut. It needs to be contextualized, it needs to be inclusive, and it needs to cater for the different levels of the disabilities that people have. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. And you were talking earlier about how some people are still shielding, they're still isolating, they aren't able to come out into the world like those of us who are so lucky here can do. And so the world has kind of moved on. We've kind of tried to go back to normal. And so now people are being left out of education, of healthcare, and that's something that we need to be really cognizant of. We need to be actively including these people and bringing them to the table.
Yeah. That's something that you just said that I've never thought of before, the kind of spontaneous support for you of someone who with disabilities, of people during COVID have been more wary of, because we don't touch each other, how that must have really impacted people. And I wonder if there's still fearfulness around that for people now.
Sorry, was that
That was a bit of a question of like, do you think that there's still some sort of that we've picked up habits during COVID that really still impact people with disabilities now?
Really interesting question. I think if you look at the disabled people's movement in Britain before the pandemic, there were lots of campaigns to try and find hybrid solutions, for instance, to employment or to education. And many of those things were quickly taken on board when the pandemic hit, which was really frustrating for disabled people who have been shouting about this for a while. Just a caveat, I use disabled people as the accepted language in Britain, but globally, people with disabilities and UN language is that. As a disabled person, that's the language I like to use. So going back to hybrid, the pandemic, I think there were several lessons that we've learned. We learned a good practice of how to do online meetings, how to interact with people, how to try and include different communities. And in many ways, I see us now as a society moving away from those lessons and going back to all-person, in-person meetings. So I think it's about drawing out some of the things that we've learned and making sure that they're embedded and there is a legacy that's continued of that. But I definitely think that for some people, there is a real health anxiety still around the pandemic. And I think it's about making sure that there are structures in place, preventative measures or things to implementation plans if another global pandemic or emergency were to occur again. And that disabled people are included in that. And at the center of those plans.
And to that point, I wrote it down earlier. You were talking about whether disabled people are aware of their rights. And so I was wondering if that should be included in formal education curriculums and how we should go about that.
Yeah, great question. Something that I almost hear every week in the UK is, oh, well, I know that we've got this Equality Act that was introduced in 2010, but what on earth does that mean? And I think that's a really great question. And part of the Equality Act in the UK is that we have reasonable adjustments. And so many disabled people, not through their own faults, sometimes can't quite make out what it means, a reasonable adjustment. What does it look like? And even still, oh, but is this too expensive? And all of these questions are really valuable and important questions that people should be able to have that information and access to. So I think formal education, like a human rights-based approach to understanding some of these topics, really important. And in the UK setting, the Equality Act covers lots of different characteristics. So we're not just talking about disabled people in this instance. But I also think that is informal ways of learning, of sharing information within different communities, across different communities, through social media, obviously be wary of misinformation. And creative ways through artwork, through music, through applications. All of these ways are great ways of moving forward with learning and knowing about rights.
I have some questions from our audience, unless anyone has anything else they would like to bring to the table before I dive in. No? Okay, so from Flo. Hi, Flo. I have a question about the unique challenges of the digital divide in rural communities, especially in places where knowledge is mostly shared downwards through generations, and whether technology has changed that direction so that young people are teaching older people for the first time.
So this is actually a really interesting debate within scholarship in general, and especially in science scholarship, because you have a lot of indigenous knowledge, especially in the United States and Canada, but also Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, where yes, it has been passed down orally through generations, and this knowledge is legitimate scholarship. These people are true experts, but because it's not written down and it's not been peer reviewed, it's not considered truth. It's not considered scholarship. And so this is something that we really need to work on as an academic community and anyone in education, how to incorporate these diverse voices and preserve them, not just the facts that they can provide us, but like the actual medium, how to preserve how this information is brought down through the generations, because you lose a lot if you can't actually hear the person telling you. So a good way actually could possibly be video recording, but then how do people access it?
Yeah, yeah, that's so true.
I think I could also weigh in on that by giving a context of Africa on how knowledge used to be preserved. I have this habit of visiting cultural centers in our country and museums, and you get to learn a lot about how the early man used to do some things. And sometimes we think that people from the the previous early generations did not have information, but they used to use art. They would carve out things in wood regarding things that they have seen, and they would have them. And that is how you hear fire. That is how fire was discovered. It was just someone just randomly took 2 pieces of wood and just started rubbing them and discovered, voila, this is fire. And so during the early times of life, there was a form of preserving knowledge. There was a form of doing things by the tools that they had at the time. And so you go to cultural centers, at least they have some form of information about how that knowledge has been preserved from generation to generation. But now we deal in a digital age where nowadays it is no longer about photos in an album. They're somewhere in a phone, and if that phone is lost, that set of history also goes down with it. And so that is a conversation about how technology helps us and how sometimes it might not work for good for us. But it is also, I think technology is already here. The question is, what more can we do with it? We can do something. It is here to stay. We cannot avoid it. And so when I think about how do we preserve that knowledge, it is a question of ensuring that the digital technology that we have at this particular time is capable of putting that information in a way that in the absence of technology, it will it can be found. It will not, I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense, because so one of the things is, as I am a librarian as well as an academic.
And you're good on data sets.
Well, but honestly, the most secure way, even today, the most secure way of preserving knowledge, preserving some kind of fact, is to put it on a piece of paper and stick it on a shelf. Like because technology develops so fast, think about how many people have access to a floppy disk drive anymore. Mm-hmm. Or a CD, right? So we lose a lot of data, we lose a lot of information as technology develops, but we still have books.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I just pop in there? Yeah. One thing that we're assuming is that something can be written down.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. British Sign Language and other forms of sign language, there isn't a means often of translating it into written English or into written formats. Yeah. So actually I'm seeing lots of apps where you can track the evolution of different signs. So as British Sign Language changes, there are ways of tracking different dialects in different parts of the country, for example, and there are historical projects to capture different deaf histories. So actually, yeah, I completely agree that written documents are great and you can learn so much from it. But equally, there are means of innovation to make sure that communication in different formats, and Makaton, for instance, or sign language are still included. So yeah, I think there's a compromise.
I mean, I completely just contradicted myself when at first I was talking about Indigenous voices and preserving it, and then I'm going, but write it all down, it's fine.
I suspect we are living in a world where we have to look at how we used to do things in the past and understand that it still has a place in our present. Yeah. Because as you've said, writing something and having it somewhere, it is important for us to also think about it. Like, we cannot do away with books completely and go completely digital as we would like. We have to take into account that sometimes digital systems can fail, and there needs to be a backup in the form of something written and somewhere in hard copy to be found.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I wonder if that risks putting it on the shelf and leaving it there and it doesn't get touched again.
Well, I mean, there are entire rooms in the Oxford libraries that are inaccessible. And so there are facts that we don't have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So another question for you, Liz, is you said national policies affect girls' education success. Can you say what aspects of national policies create that effect?
Yeah, honestly, the biggest predictor in the model, okay, so in my model from my PhD research, so there, I could be completely wrong, but I'm an academic, I have to say that. The biggest predictor of girls' educational success was the required education in her country. What age she is required to attend school to. That was, yes. So for every additional year that a girl is required to be in school above the average, it was something like another 13 points that you could expect her to achieve on the math test that was being used. So that's actually huge. Also really big, other really big predictors were the global region. And I used the United Nations SDG global regions just for my own convenience. But one of the reasons I used region is because quite often, because of sociopolitical changes over time, there are regional differences. There's often shared cultural values as well as legal systems. So when you're looking at regionality, you can kind of see, oh, well, Western Europe tends to do this kind of a thing versus Northern Africa tends to do that kind of a thing.
Okay.
And then a really big one is also women, women's access to society. So whether or not the society believes that women should be allowed to work outside of the home, how many women are involved in politics, how many women are involved, how many women-owned businesses there are in that country, that kind of thing. So access to the world, economic empowerment and social empowerment was a huge thing.
Right, and then my last question that I have so far, unless anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A box if you do, is how does the panel feel that culture impacts the way that we teach or enforce or create policies around disabilities? So I guess this is more for you.
I think culture has a massive influence on how we understand disability. Even that conversation earlier about people with disabilities versus disabled people. Language is a big part in that. We've seen a real move away from the language that has been used in the 1980s, for instance, in Britain. If we're thinking about television, there are great initiatives that have taken place in terms of Open Door, which was a programme created by the National Union of the Deaf to try and make deaf and hearing communities understand the issues that deaf people face from deaf perspectives. And that's still on air today. We're also seeing changes in representation, so more disabled people, people with Down syndrome, for instance, wheelchair users on mainstream programmes. And I think television has a really, really important role in culture, but also in how we see the world. So it definitely does have an impact. And I think it would be great to see some of those shifts in education and formal education structures. And there definitely is in curriculums still a lack of diverse education. Who is included in that educational practice? Why and what are the gaps? And I think we should really interrogate those questions and work out, okay, how can we, not for the sake of just doing it, but actually have a meaningful impact, make sure that different communities are represented.
Okay, so I think that is the end of our questions that we have been sent in. So I just wanted to kind of ask you now for kind of a little wrap-up comment of your final thoughts on the agreed conclusions, the impact of COVID, and where we are now and where you hope that maybe we could be going in your ideal words.
Oh, you want Oh, wow. What was the question again?
Your final thoughts, anything that you kind of want to bring, or ideally around impact of COVID on rural women and where we could be going in the near future.
I think I'll start from what I said earlier, that currently the world is in a place where we're having this term called post-COVID. thinking that the pandemic is completely done.
Mhm.
And we have discussed how the pandemic has changed our behavior. While we have learned to be socially distant, at the same time, we have also that those measures are currently lifted in the majority of the world, but COVID has given us some behaviors that are evident, either by the way we relate with people, either by the way we distance ourselves physically, or in the way we react when we're in public spaces. I think I'm one person where nowadays I am so vigilant when I'm in public spaces, whether it's a good thing or it's a fear thing. I'm not sure where it falls. It could be both. But now, governments or our communities, we need to take into account that while we are not praying for another pandemic, our governments need to be keen on how do we handle emergencies when they come in future. COVID might not be the last one. The next one might be worse. And governments ought to have proper response mechanisms that do not take a long time, and rural girls, rural women are left out. By the time they are reached, it is either too late, and there are some cases that have happened that are worrying, either in terms of sexual and gender-based violence, either you're caught behind with education or you have not had access to help. So that is something to think about going into the future of how we respond as countries when we are hit with world emergencies, so to say. Thank you.
I think the biggest thing is data. Because we're constantly talking, we hear politicians and diplomats talking about how we need to have evidence-based policy positions. We need to have data behind any kind of policy position we want. So we need to start interrogating the data itself and the data collection policies to ensure that there aren't hidden figures, that we aren't losing people and their stories by just ignoring them.
Yeah. And on that as well, and our conversation around language being lost when it's not written down, I just wanted to highlight that in December 2022, just gone, was the start of the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages, and the acknowledgement through that of the importance of preserving thousands of languages that can't necessarily be written down, that don't necessarily already exist on the internet, as well as sign languages and other non-traditional languages.
Just to go off that, this week ACWW had a talk by Dr. Teresa Kennedy from the University of Texas, and it was a fabulous talk. I'm not paid to say this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. He was talking about the ocean, Indigenous language, and rural communities as a call to action. And there were so many really, really insightful points that Dr. Kennedy made about Indigenous communities, rural communities, and I thought there were lots of parallels to deaf communities across the globe. So I hear what you're saying and completely agree. I think my final thoughts for this session would be we need to still work on progress within education, particularly around empowerment and agency, and not talk about inclusion as a tokenistic thing that we should be doing. It's not passive work, but we all have an active role to play. And I just urge everybody to think about what individual role can I play? Where can I talk about deafness or disability in rooms where it's not being discussed? And how can our organisations move forward? What can be done? Because it's a constantly moving process. And part of that is talking to deaf and disabled young women and young rural people. But that's where I'd leave it, with education, empowerment and agency.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for this really fruitful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was fun to sit and talk to other young women
about
things that we're passionate about.
I've learned quite a lot.
Thank you.